Mark Reckless.
Diolch, yes. We are around 7 years into a period of economic recovery, albeit from an absolutely terrible recession. There's been substantial growth in the overall UK and Welsh economies. Unemployment is really very low by historical comparisons, at least over the last 30 years in both Wales and the UK. The budget deficit at a UK level is still approaching £70 billion, approximately 4% of GDP. Yet the majority of people in this Assembly appear to speak as if there could be a great new borrowing binge, as if austerity is a choice rather than a necessity. If at this stage of the economic cycle you are still borrowing 4% of GDP, then the idea that you can go on a borrowing binge from here is, I think, for the birds. Actually, the only reason, responding to Adam Price, that we've been able to sustain this situation is because £425 billion of that borrowing has been cancelled, in effect, by the Bank of England. Yet we cannot presume that that loose monetary policy of 0.25% bank rate and £425 billion of quantitative easing is going to continue. And when it reverses, which I believe may be sooner than people in the main expect, then it's going to be very difficult to carry on borrowing at this level. We've seen in the last month or two that long-term interest rates have increased by about a third compared to where they were, and that will over time flow through into budgeting on a UK basis and through that to this Assembly. I mean, I speak with relatively modestly, and I don't plan a great partisan spiel today. It's my first year within the budgeting process of this Assembly, and as the Finance Minister has said, the system is changing. I have some experience of budgeting at a council level, a police authority level, and indeed to the extent it happens there at all at Westminster. But I don't want to presume from similarities that things are the same, because there are key and important distinctions. I've particularly disappointment to be informed that today we vote on a take-note motion on the draft budget, and then when the final budget comes to us in January, I am informed that there is simply an up-down vote on the motion, and the budget itself is unamendable. I think that's disappointing. It reflects the situation at Westminster, but only since the 1930s. Prior to that, MPs could and did amend government spending plans, and I think it would be a more healthy system if party groups or ministers were able to, or members were able to put amendments to the government's budget and have votes in this place on whether they should be agreed or not. Another thing I find... Yes, very happy to.
The member makes an interesting point, which many other Commonwealth countries, for example, and federal countries do use that process, but they do have safeguards around it, particularly as where extra expenditure is involved and you don't balance the budget with extra income. But he will have the opportunity to take that view forward as we do debate through the Business Committee and through the Assembly itself, how we take forward a new look at the budget process.
Excellent. I look forward to working with the Chair of the Finance Committee and others on that, and I think that the proposal that any change in a budget line that were to be submitted as a motion should at the same time have an amendment as to either an increase in taxation or a reduction in spending which would counter that. But subject to that, I think we would benefit from having that democratic process. I'm also grateful to Simon Thomas, also to Nick Ramsey, both of whom have been generous with their time in explaining to me the particularities of the budget process setting here, and also to the Cabinet Secretary, who has been very forthcoming to the Finance Committee, both on the two bills that we are considering and onto this budget scrutiny which we have fitted within that. One other area I think of challenge, at least to my understanding of how the process works here, and perhaps to others, is quite what this relationship is between Plaid and the Labour Party. I had understood that what had been agreed was that Plaid would allow the budget to go through. I'm still unclear whether that is abstention or support, in return for a series of specific changes to that budget that would be agreed by Plaid. For instance, the 300,000 for the looking at the Carmarthen to Aberystwyth railway and whether we can bring that back. I trust that Plaid will be as keen in monitoring how that money is being spent and ensuring value for money as they have at agreeing it in the first place. But it seems by doing that they are allowing through quite a lot of other things in these budget which they got no sight of in advance, yet somehow are now associated with. And I felt that Adam Price's speech was quite some way to defending the budget as a whole rather than merely just the specific applied elements within it. I think we would all benefit from greater clarity as to how that relationship is working. I also think the Finance Committee, I'm proud of the document we've produced in a very short timescale. I'm not quite sure of the status of that document in this debate. It's referred to as a supporting document. I wonder actually if this Assembly and Plenary were to vote on those recommendations and whether they were supported by the Assembly as a whole. We have had a cross-party agreement in committee. I think that would strengthen the position further of the Assembly in the budget scrutiny process, and I look forward to the Cabinet Secretary telling us what, if any, parts of the budget he's going to amend in response to those. I think we have this Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out on whether this is an effective piece of legislation or is virtue signalling on a number of very worthy goals which aren't then followed up and made to happen through the day-to-day process of government and legislation. So I look forward to seeing changes that may or may not come in that area. Overall, I would characterise the budget as a steady-as-she-goes budget. There's a lot of budget lines where there's no change to the spending. The Cabinet Secretary did find additional money for health, which we support. I'm most struck by the local government settlement relative at least to the spending we see set by the UK government largely for England, because it's that local government area that seems to me to have had less reductions in Wales relative to the very, very sharp cuts that local councils in England have experienced. And the corollary of that is health having had cuts in England, in Wales, that it hasn't faced in England. I know that some of that may reflect what is going on with social care and the NHS, and I think it's sensible for the government to consider that in the way it does. But overall, the local government settlement looks vulnerable for future years. And in our Finance Committee report, we said the draft budget this year is a better settlement for money than was expected. Organisations should be using the settlement to prepare for tougher times ahead. The committee was concerned not to have seen evidence of this preparation taking place, and cites particularly health service and local government. But in local government, we've got elections in May, and the suspicion has to be that there are going to be severe cuts in local government that may be put off till next year, and rather than planning for those reductions now, local governments are concentrating on pump priming for the council elections in May, and we will then see severe reductions in the year or two to follow that might well have been better planned. For the health service, disappointed to see that we have this statutory requirement for 3-year budgeting. We have all these interest groups and partner organisations coming to us and saying they want a plan for the long term, yet several of these health organisations haven't actually set those 3-year budgets as required by statute. We have seen these very significant, between 30 and 5 and 40%, depending which year you look at, cuts to the capital budget for climate change projects. I remember being assailed quite aggressively by Carl Sargent prior to the election how UKIP wanted to cut this budget, and yet the government comes back and the first budget cuts it by over a third. One must admit to being somewhat perplexed. One questions the Cabinet Secretary and told actually this isn't going to affect the climate change goals or objectives or what the government's going to achieve in this field, in which case, why was this money being spent under the climate change area if it wasn't actually required to meet those goals? I wonder if these climate change capital projects will be like the higher education budget perhaps was last year, and we may see substantive parts of that put back following what we've learnt in the autumn statement. I'd like to be assured that what's happening in terms of energy efficiency and fuel poverty is well connected between the energy company schemes and Nest and what the Welsh Government is doing, and similarly with local government and its responsibilities in flood protection. And I think it would be good if we looked at these particular schemes on their merits and subject them to good forensic scrutiny, rather than simply because they're described as climate change sort of projects, having them extolled by the government as self-evidently good, or indeed criticised by others as if they weren't. We should look at their merits, and I think it's very, very important we get the budget expenditure lines out there early on. It really is unsatisfactory to have very, very broad budgets announced and then to find out significantly later that actually the picture is very, very different than it appeared because of what is going on at that level. I really think it would benefit the overall budget process, public scrutiny and democratic involvement in Wales if those bills were announced at the same time as the draft budget in order that people can work for proper budget scrutiny and effect. I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary and for the time.